Actually, we see the sun exactly as much as anybody else.
Because, get more during the summertime than
Yeah, everywhere on the earth, except for clouds, has exactly as much sun as anywhere else. If you think about it, it's just, you get it in different bunches. If you're around the equator, it's really boring. It's just bloop, bloop. There it is. Here we get it. It's just real. Without you here. So my thesis was totally wrong.
It's been debunked.
It's not because you're here.
Why is this line in
Yeah, like reflected hits myself in the face and I'm trying to do the piece.
So we were talking about Schopenhauer, we were talking about music, we were talking about Wagner. I don't know if I emphasized that he invented the lead motif. If you listen to his operas without even seeing what's going on, you can actually get a sense of what's happening because the music is describing the scene, because you get used to what each of the different little melodies, the motifs mean. The sword, the Valkyries. Somebody mentioned, my favorite song from Wagner is the Ride of the Valkyries from Apocalypse Now. Yes. Sorry I didn't play that. Everyone knows that one, right? I'm trying to think of it now. No, that's not it. Of course, for my generation, we grew up with Kill the Wabbit, Kill the Wabbit. Bugs Bunny. Violent cartoon. Today we're going to switch to England again, back and forth, and John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill was a precocious kid. I don't know if he wanted to be, but his dad made him. Some of you are familiar with that kind of thing. They dump you into all kinds of programs and make you learn a lot, even before you're old enough to realize that's what's happening to you. So he's like reading Greek and reading the Greek plays and everything before he's like 8 years old or something. In fact, I think at 8 years old, his dad made him the tutor for the younger children. Never sent him to school, taught him at home. In fact, even when he was old enough to go to Cambridge or Oxford, because he was an atheist and didn't agree with the oath that you have to take in order to get into either of those schools, because you have to be a Church of England person to be eligible. He couldn't go to those schools, so he went to the University of London instead, which is, I suppose, okay. He had a mental breakdown when he was, about 18, 20, somewhere in there. And it was because he was studying too much. He just had a overloaded head. But he got out of it. He went to France. Studied there for a while. In fact, he's buried in Avignon with his wife, Harriet. So that's interesting. Why you would do it. He's actually Scottish. Raised in England. His family's Scottish. And one of the main influences on him was Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham and John Mill's father were both utilitarians and wanted to make sure that John Stuart Mill would grow up to be like the brainiac that would continue utilitarianism into the future. Of course he did. But Jeremy Bentham is pretty cool. What's interesting is that Bentham still attends, even though he's dead, he still attends every Royal Society meeting. They wheel him in because that was part of his will, that he would continue to attend them all. So they have him in a box. In fact, that's his real head. They have him in this box, which is like a phone booth with a glassed-in phone booth. The head is sitting at the feet of this. That's a wax image of his face, but that's his real body. There's
What is this?
let's see where the head. Oh, here's the head in this one. See, the head is sitting down at its feet. But they wheel this whole thing into every Royal Society meeting, and they write him in the log as having attended. That's pretty funny, I suppose. But I guess if you went into the British Museum, this is what you would have seen as you walked in. Somewhere in the entrance, they had this. I guess you could do a selfie with him. That's pretty cool. That's not. So that's pretty interesting, I suppose. But so what is utility? Utility is the belief that it's really Epicurean in the sense that happiness, physical happiness, is the goal of every moment, basically. So the goal of any ethical system is for us to be happy. If anything, though, the problem is you want the most people possible to be happy. So decisions that you should be made with the goal of making the most happiness, creating the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. For the longest time, so it's not like we should just have a party right now and use up all our resources and then die tomorrow. No, but you know, if you basically want to be scientific about happiness, and so we literally end up with what's referred to as a hedonistic calculus, where a hedon is a unit of pleasure. So you try to figure out how many hedons of pleasure will we get if we do this. You know, so if we go to the movie, how many hedons will we have? So hedonism, just living for pleasure. And John Stuart Mill. John Austin, as a legal philosopher, was also one of John Stuart Mill's teachers when he was at the University of London. That's the one. It's at the University of London. I thought it was at the museum. So he's interesting all on his own. But John Stuart Mill guess about, let's see, he dies at 67, so he's, what, 64 there, I guess. He does marry Harriet Taylor, and between the two of them, they co-write a book on the rights of women. And he's also the first politician in England to actually put forth a bill to give women equal rights, completely equal rights in England. They didn't win, but he was the first one to start trying to do that. And he's just, wow, a completely, he's not a specialist in anything, he kind of knows everything. So he was into everything: chemistry, biology, economics, politics, ethics, logic. When we think of Mill's methods, we usually think of this as the real beginnings of remember Francis Bacon comes up with the new tool, the novum organum, but he doesn't really start a new movement towards studying science using an inductive reasoning process. Instead, it waits until John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill's the one that refined our inductive reasoning process by introducing what we think today obviously are really just common sense notions about cause and effect relationships. What's referred to as the direct method of agreement, when we look at a series of causes or phenomena, and we have an actual relationship, that's one to one, one to one, one to one. Every time we have this, we have this. You put the bowl of milk down, the cat comes. Put the bowl of milk down, the cat comes. You think, well, the cat likes milk. Simple, example. But so we have direct method of agreement. When you have this, then you have this. Pretty easy. So A, B, C, D occur together with W, X, Y, Z, etc. A is the cause or effect of W. So you can figure that out. Method of difference, of course, would be just sort of the opposite. Whenever something's not there, something doesn't happen, well, then there must be a relationship between them. So A, B, C, D occur together. B, C, D occur together with X, Y, Z. Therefore, A is the cause or effect of part of the cause of W. So then the joint method is where you put both of those together, and obviously that's much stronger even than either method singly. And you feel like, well, duh, right? This is all common sense. The surprise is no one thought of that until now. So you think, wow, this is really, one of the things that people still believed, for example, was that life was spontaneously generated. So for example, they thought if you had a shirt that was damp and you had a food source nearby, poof, you would have instant mice. Because the environment like demanded them, right? And it's not like you even needed parent mice. Mice would just arrive on the scene. And so Mill is famous for putting controls on experiments. So for example, you put a box around the damp shirt and the food source and see if mice spontaneously generate in the shirt. Guess what? No. Because with the box in the way, the parent mice that are essential to that can't show up, and so you don't get baby mice. So spontaneous life, not possible. Method of residue, I never remember studying that much. A, B, C occur together with X, Y, Z. B is known to be the cause of Y. C is known to be the cause of Z. So therefore, A is the cause of X. Concomitant variations, especially like when we think of weather, you know, if the air pressure goes up and then we get snow, then it goes down and the snow stops, we begin thinking, wow, as this cause or this particular phenomena goes up, so does this. So you end up, of course, with this concomitant variation. You know, as this goes up, so the one is the cause of the other. Notice you have to put like a little A plus there, X plus. A and X are causally connected. But we also have to have there might be lots of so he's also the one that comes up with the idea of having controls on your experiments. Also, the requirement that if you have an experiment and you publish your results, that other scientists must be able to repeat those experiments with the same results. Otherwise, you know, it's bogus, right? You know, if it works for you but it doesn't work for me, then no, I don't trust your results. You're doing something. You're not telling me something, right? So that's interesting. So it's also interesting if you think about roughly the same time. There's a wonderful book, The Philosophical Breakfast Club, which is about these four, Babbage, oh shoot, I can't remember all their names. Okay, Charles Babbage, John Herschel, William Whewell, and Richard Jones. So these are all four friends who are students at Cambridge and basically brought science into the national state of affairs as a enterprise that the government itself should participate in and fund. So, for example, Charles Babbage gives us this calculating machine, which filled the whole room, was paid for by the government, was very, very expensive. It doesn't run on electricity or anything. You have to hand crank all of the calculations. And they never ended up using it for anything. So it was, you know, a lot of people thought it was absolute boondoggle, total waste of time, kind of a bridge to nowhere sort of thing, right? What the heck do we need that for? But of course, it was significant as an early calculating machine. I actually have the book of all his paperwork submitting the plans to the government letters asking for the money, etc., all that sort of thing. The library threw it out, and so that was kind of interesting. Or looked like. So that's pretty interesting. Notice they're all contemporaries of Mill. So, how about ethics? The problem with ethics, if you're reading Hegel, Hegel gives us this concept of progress. Remember, I argued, a problem with that comes with the idea that our ethical norms improve generation by generation or every significant event. I mean, you wouldn't say that the 1100s were significantly better than the 900s, I don't think. But clearly, the way we treat people today, we want to universalize our ethical norms so that we're applying them to all people, and perhaps even animals too. So we're pushing. We especially want to protect endangered species, for example, and so on. So our conception of who ought to be treated properly has been expanding, and we think of that as progress, moral progress. Well, the problem, of course, is once you realize there is such a thing, and it makes sense to say that there's moral progress, the question then becomes is how do you decide what is good? Because what we think of as good today might not be good, 20 years from now. We might think, it's great that we invented robots, that can help us when we're old, and make us, therapy animals and things of that sort. By the way, I saw Paro this weekend. I don't know if you've ever heard of Paro, the professor. So this is Paro.
Modeled on a baby-top seal, displays emotional responses to external stimuli, which are input via a range of tactile, light, audio, and temperature sensors. Paro is designed to have a positive psychological effect on people who interact with them.
He speaks 5 languages, by the way. He's the one that was here giving the presentation. The fur is the most expensive part to make, by the way.
In long-term trials by medical institutions, it's been confirmed that Paro has similar effects to animal therapy. Major results have been observed in 3 areas: psychological, physiological, and social effects.
So we might think, oh, it's so wonderful that we're inventing these robots, etc.
Did you go to the conference?
Yes. Yeah, that's where he presented this. And I didn't go to the Friday night presentation.
I went to that one.
Oh, you did? Because I was in class, so I couldn't go to that one. But I was at the Friday day things and then the Saturday day things until 3. No, I didn't go to the last one because I was like tired, so I drove home. Woke up when I got home. It's a nice thing about the Glen Highway. You can drive home without being awake because it's so those grooves help.
Pretty sure you're not supposed to do that, but.
No.
Paro is priced at 350,000 yen with a 1-year warranty and 420,000 yen with a 3-year warranty.
So that's so we might think, wow, that's absolutely wonderful. So what did you think of it? Did you get to pet it?
Yeah, I got to pet it. It's very soft.
Heavy.
I know
Right?
it is heavy. I thought it was interesting that it takes 2 hours to do the eyelashes alone.
Oh. He
Well,
explained
look at
it.
those eyelashes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the fur, he said, was the most expensive part, but it's all computer motherboards and everything inside. And did he show the film where he went out on the ice in Canada and actually interviewed a few baby seals and their parents? He showed that. That was kind of neat, taking all that effort out there. So I guess he actually recorded their sounds that they made out there, and that's how he incorporated the sounds that they make. So that's pretty neat. But so So we might think, oh, this is such a wonderful new development that we could use these tools, and then we end up with, you know, the future. I'm going to ruin this for you. She's actually a robot. He doesn't know that yet. How many of you have seen the movie? So you all know what happens at the end, right? She passes the Turing test. And what does that mean? Well, actually, she doesn't, but Ava does. Right?
What were you doing with Ava? What? You tore up her picture. I'm gonna tear up the fucking dance floor, dude. Check it out.
So you get the idea, I think, right? So here we are making these cute robots. In another 10 years, they're going to be killing us. So it seems like a good idea now, but it could very well be absolutely the worst thing we've ever done is created life that turns out to be smarter than us. There's a book called Superintelligence. If you're curious, I have it. It's pretty interesting. Arguing that it's only going to be within about 10 years that we're going to have computers actually controlling at least some human beings and actually controlling enough important things in our economy and so on, that the computers are literally going to be in charge of us in those areas. And so we've got to get it right. We've got to figure out exactly how we make sure that computers treat human beings nicely. And as they've started to try to program these computers to make sure that they do treat us nicely, they've discovered what they don't know enough about human ethics to do that. So we don't really know, like, so if we use like the, so superintelligence asks the questions, what happens when machines surpass humans in general intelligence? Will artificial agents save or destroy us? If we go to Asimov's laws of robotics, there's 3, right?
4, actually.
4, actually? What's the 4th one?
The 0th law.
I don't know that one.
It comes up later in the series.
A robot may not injure a human being. So, what about a robot that's like a doctor and has to slice you open in order to remove your gallbladder or something, right?
Technically, it's not injuring you, it's fixing you.
Right, but what you have to do is make sure that you've explained that to the computer.
I don't want a computer.
It might actually be better than having a doctor do that.
It probably has a code. Like, you know, when you do like calculator and you say X is this, except for when X is like 1 or something, then you could probably code the robot to say you can not injure a human unless X equals, you know.
But you have to be very, very, very specific, because if I have like a Roomba going around the room vacuuming and so on, and you have some money there, we don't want it to vacuum the money, do we? But I don't think a Roomba would be able, you wouldn't be able to tell a Roomba that that's money, don't vacuum that. If it's on the floor and, you know, where you dropped it, you didn't notice it because you were drunk when you came home. I'm just kidding, totally. And you're wondering, how come my money is always gone in the morning? Well, it's because the Roomba is just, you know what a Roomba is, right?
There's a bunch of pictures of it vacuuming a dog turd and it smeared it all over the.
Oh, jeez. You're kidding.
No, it's pretty hilarious. It's the Roomba dog turd again. Yeah.
So is this gonna affect us?
I don't know, I haven't seen a video of it, but there's pictures of it.
My house smells like crap because the dog decided to take a big dump right here in front of the TV. You'll notice that it's smeared all over the house because apparently he took this dump prior to 8 o'clock when there's some more crap. When the automatic iRobot is set to take off to do a little house sweeping while we're not home. So he took this big giant crap and my iRobot smeared it all over my living room and house. Couldn't be happier right now. Unbelievable.
Thanks for that.
I just like
Well, so part of the problem with utilitarianism is that we can't actually predict how the future is going to go. So utilitarianism as an ethic is referred to as a consequentialist system. So consequences are what's important. So actually it's perfectly fine for me to do evil things if the goal is good. Right? So if the overall goal is good, I can do like bad things. So for example, doctors doing those famous experiments on people, right? Where they like had 100 men, all who had syphilis, and they decided, okay, let's do an experiment. I think that was even referred to as the Philadelphia experiment. And so what they decided to do was to treat their symptoms with fake placebos, because what they really wanted to do is see how the disease progressed in each of the men. So basically they could care less about the individual health of those individuals. Instead, what they wanted to do is see what the disease did to them. So they treated them as an experiment. They didn't treat them as an end in themselves, as Kant argues. Instead, they treated them as a means to an end, figuring that once they learned more about syphilis, then they would be able to help millions of people. So these guys turned out to be guinea pigs, right, for the benefit of mankind. So you could do an evil thing to these 100 people with the idea that the greater good, so if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, you could see that British utilitarian phrase for the greater good is part of that utilitarian philosophical ethic, right? You know, it's the greater good. You know, it's bad for you, but it's good for humankind, right? So consequentialists are allowed to do evil things in order to have a good beneficial result, right? The trouble, of course, is, well, what if it turned out that instead of helping mankind, those 100 people ended up with like Ebola or something, and they went on to infect everyone, and we all got wiped out, you know? Kind of like the Andromeda strain, maybe, or something, you know, if you're familiar with Michael Crichton's first novel, right? You know, the idea that, you know, we end up experimenting on diseases to see if we can find out how these diseases work, but accidentally we let some out of the lab that end up destroying mankind, right? You know, so the problem with consequentialism is our science isn't good enough for us to predict the future, and the things that we might be doing that are bad now might also have bad results in the future. But either way, a lot of people feel like it's totally ethically wrong for doctors to do evil things to certain individuals for the greater good, because you're hurting those people, and that sounds immoral if you come from a Kantian perspective. Kant, remember, argued that the moral imperative, the categorical imperative is you cannot use an individual as a means to an end. You have to treat every single human being as intrinsically valuable on their own. So I can't torture people, right? So capture the enemy. Should we torture this person to try to find out what his fellow terrorists are planning in New York City on the 4th of July? For a utilitarian, absolutely. We should torture him, do whatever we can in order to make sure we find out all the information possible, because we have to save all those people. They might be ready to blow them up. A Kantian, on the other hand, no, you're not allowed to torture anyone. You can ask him the questions, hopefully he'll tell you the answers, but if he doesn't, well, you can't torture him, because that's ethically immoral, right? Oof, right? You see the difference. So from a Kantian perspective, no torture is allowed, no experimentation on humans, at least without their consent. It's a different thing. So in a sense, we've moderated that. An awful lot of those experiments today, we have this pill, it might help your cancer, but it's experimental. We don't really know whether it'll help you or not. Do you want to try it? And you get to sign the form. But they've openly told you what the possibilities are, right? In previous experiments, they said, oh, we've got the cure, here you go. They lied to you, basically, in order to get you to participate in the experiment. And then who knows what happens to you, but they'll keep track, right? So we've changed legally those kinds of things, at least in this country, so that we don't experiment on people like that. Can't build a factory where you have the people all locked into the factory, maybe even chain them to their sewing machines so that they keep producing even though they have to pee. You don't let them have breaks or anything. And of course, if the factory catches fire, all these people are dead meat because, of course, they can't get out. 300 women die, everybody protests, but the goal of it was to make money. You're using those people as a means to an end, not as a intrinsically valuable person on their own, etc. So utility has certain problems with it. On the other hand, it's a response to the relativity of value. How do we actually create a moral ethic in tune with science? Because in some sense, what we have to do is learn, we have to experiment, and we have to realize that progress is going to mean that what's valuable and moral in the future is not what's moral and valuable today. It might turn out that, for example, how many people are there in the world today, roughly?
7.328 billion.
So roughly 7.328 277,736 billion people. Thanks for the general number there. That's excellent. When I was born, I think we had roughly 1.5 billion people, something like that, and most of them were Chinese. We had this image, if you have all the Chinese people lined up in tens marching by, the line will never stop, because that's how many people there are, there's just so many Chinese So in my one lifetime, so I'm 64 now, right? And this is the oldest I've ever been, right? The population has quadrupled, right? And one of the reasons it's quadrupled is because we feel ethically progressive and feel like we should help all human beings. And so if we have starving people in the Sudan, we should feed them. So we send plane loads of MREs to the desert, drop them by pallets on these people, which is really an ugly sight if you see 2 or 3 people crushed by one of these pallets as it comes down. Full of MRE, boxes of MREs. Plus, what we discovered after the first couple of months was that if you feed a whole bunch of starving, water-deprived people MREs, you kill them. Because as soon as they eat the MREs and they expand in their stomach and absorb all the water that they have in their system, they dehydrate and die. And there's too much protein in a lot of, those meals are made for healthy infantrymen out working hard, you know, and not for people that are like practically incapacitated from hunger, right? So that was actually it was kind of a utilitarian move because those were all expired MREs. So they thought, how do we get rid of all of these? Hey, let's just drop them in Sudan. It was a good paper, you know, thing. You know, it made it look good. Like, you know, we didn't waste all those MREs. We fed them to all these starving people. But then they found out they were actually killing people with these. You know, you eat a styrofoam piece of strawberries, and you have no water to eat with it, right? It could actually kill you if you're already dying of thirst. So that was pretty awful, right? Talk about a Coke bottle sitting out in the. So they refined their methods, of course, and now have all kinds of kitchens and tent cities out there where all these people sit and procreate. Because actually there's nothing else for them to do. So if you've ever seen pictures of them, there's all these starving people now in the desert. 4 times as many starving people as there were starving people 10 years ago, because they keep making more people. The more we feed them, the more they have. In fact, if we notice, one of the reasons for the migration of refugees from Syria and so on, if you looked at Syria, the pictures of Syria, that's a desert. There's nothing there, right? And so where did all these millions of people come from that grew up there? Well, modern methods of feeding people. You know, so you grow the corn in Iowa, and it's already intensely genetically modified. It uses fertilizers that come from petroleum products. By the way, none of these are real foods. So if we talk about the omnivore's dilemma,
seem to be so much variety here that this is all the same program. And I teach at Berkeley, and I have a colleague in the biology department who's Mexican American, and I was talking to him about this one day. And I said, you know, I think North Americans now may be more the people of corn than you Mexicans. And of course the Mexicans always call themselves the people of corn because they have this sense of this sacred plant that is actually their flesh, you know, that they're made of. Mexicans do not sweeten their soft drinks with high fructose corn syrup. They don't like the taste of it. And they still fatten their animals on grass because they believe that there's something almost sacrilegious about feeding corn, this sacred grain, to animals, although that's changing pretty quickly. So he listened to me and he said, well, you know, you could prove that. I said, really? You know, for me, I'm an English major, it's a literary conceit, that's all I needed. But he said, you could actually prove it. And I said, how? He said, well, go talk to Todd Dawson, one of his colleagues in biology, and Todd Dawson I went and talked to, and he has a mass spectrometer. And he said, well, sure, you can prove that because of reasons I won't go into, the botanists here know, but the corn is a very distinctive kind of plant, and in fact it has a slightly different signature. Its carbon isotopes are slightly different, the ratio between 13 and 12.
Are you familiar with this stuff already?
The identity of corn is actually preserved all through the food chain. From the moment it's picked, whether it's turned into milk by being fed to a cow, or turned into high fructose corn syrup in a wet mill refinery, or turned into the various meats in that cat food, preserves its identity. So I said, you mean you can take a Coca-Cola and put it in your machine?
So the corn that we eat is in all of the foods that we eat, and so I'm actually I'm a walking corn chip. And it's not real corn, it's genetically modified corn, which is fed, by the way, not by the light of the sun, but by the fertilizers that come from petroleum, which uses a different carbon. So instead of carbon-4, it's carbon-3. So I'm not the same kind of human being that my parents were. And in fact, I'm sure we're the same. So if you use this test that he says, guess what, we're made out of corn. The characteristics that you could trace through the whole food system is actually, of course, in us just as well. So we're actually made out of corn. So the food that we're eating and producing, by the way, and by the way, the reason for this, of course, is that these foods just are huge. They grow so quickly. They're absolutely dependent on the fertilizers, by the way, which are killing the environment, by the way. So if you follow the trace of all of that going down through the rivers as it flushes out of the fields and heads down the rivers and goes out into the Gulf, it's one of the reasons, of course, why the oceans are dying. It's because of all these pollutants that we're flushing into the oceans, etc. But at the same time, what we're doing is totally transforming our ecosystem so that we're totally dependent on these modified corn products, including the cow. Corn-fed beef, the corn actually kills the cow within 2 years. So you have to, but the cows are genetically modified also, by the way, so they grow at an incredibly rapid pace. If you fed them grass, they would starve to death. They grow so fast that they would starve on grass. And so what you have to do is feed them this high corn mash that they eat. And they grow so fast that within 2 years, even though their stomachs now are acidified because of the corn, because corn is acidic, whereas grass is not, right? It's literally eating through the liner of their stomach, which is also why they have to give them so many medicines, which is why when we eat their beef, we're getting not only not real beef in the sense of the generations ago, but instead it's corn-based beef, fertilizers from oil-based beef, and they've got lots of medicines to keep them from dying of the diseases that they would naturally get because their health is really in trouble with the intensive farming and so on. So you could read all these things. Michael Pollan does a lot of this. I think it's funny, by the way, that he's involved in botany so much because his name is similar to pollen, so I always think of that. It's kind of funny. He's talked about lots of issues with our food system. But so thanks to science, the food we eat is incredibly productive. Perhaps also, we are experiments. We have no clue how this new types of food and so on is going to affect us. By the way, a lot of people eat soy products, and soybeans are trying to kill us. Did you know that? Tofu is trying to kill us. The soybeans give us a biochemical that is similar to, I can't think of it. What is it that you get when you get the runner's high? What's the biochemical you get when you hit that wall and begins with an S. What is it?
Serotonin.
Serotonin, thank you. Yes, so soybeans gives us a fake serotonin, which, so.
It also lowers testosterone.
I thought it was maybe the same.
Stay away from soy. First, almost all the soy available these days is genetically modified, been treated with dangerous pesticides such as Roundup, which kills us. Second, soy is a legume. It's high in, it tends to bind minerals and remove them from the body, which may lead to mineral deficiencies, etc. I hadn't heard that. But the other issue is that it gives you a fake serotonin, which blocks your serotonin uptake, and you need serotonin in order to feel happy, relax, sleep well, and so on. So the more soy products you eat, the more problems you're going to have with depression, is the argument. And arguably the reason soy products are doing this, soybeans are trying to kill us because they think that we're eating them and that's destroying, they think of us as the enemy. And by doing this, basically, soybeans theoretically are evolving a method of trying to keep us from eating them, because if we get depressed and die, we won't eat them so much. But that's pretty dumb, because they don't realize that it's thanks to how delicious they taste that we grow so much soybeans in the first place, right? It's kind of a silly thing. So we're doing incredible amounts of experimentation, scientific experimentation on the human population. But here's the interesting thing: because we're able to produce way more food than Thomas Malthus thought we could. I mentioned Thomas Malthus before. We refer to someone who follows his thinking as Malthusian. Reverend Malthus argued that the human population, because of how we reproduce in a situation where we have plenty of food, we will outgrow the food source. And so naturally what will happen is we'll need to reduce the population cataclysmically by either famine, plague, warfare, or something of that sort. So the population basically will go up and down, up and down, up and down, because as it gets to the point where it overuses our resources, then we suffer, and the population decreases. And then, of course, once the population is decreased enough that we have plenty of food, then we reproduce again, and in a couple of generations we end up with too many people again. So that's kind of interesting, right? So that's Malthus. And he actually argued, for example, the Irish famine, famine disease, leads to a Malthusian catastrophe, right? And so he argued, don't feed the Irish. There's too many of them. It's their fault. So when they had the potato famine, don't feed them extra stuff. Just let the population naturally die off because of the famine. And so the British actually did that. So the reason for the Irish population suffering as much as it did during that Irish famine, and an awful lot of Irishmen fled to the New World, or the United States by then, right, was because the British deliberately didn't try to help them, but they actually had plenty of food. Even in Ireland, they actually sold food during that famine because the owners, the British, were making money off of it. So they continued to make money by selling food to people that could pay for it, rather than giving the food to the Irishmen right there, even on their own farms, who were starving to death. The increase of population is necessarily limited by the means of subsistence that population does invariably increase when the means of subsistence increase, and that the superior power of population is repressed and the actual population kept equal to the means of subsistence by misery and vice, right? So take that and apply it to places like the Sudan or Syria, where the population in the latest couple of generations has blossomed because of the production of all these wonderful new genetically enhanced foods. We end up having a population of the world that's blossomed way more than what, say, Malthus ever predicted. And then what happens? We have catastrophe. So in a sense, the reason we're having so many people suffering and migrations and people dying, and by the way, warfare is one of the results of this. So it's very clear that because the population outgrew the resources, you end up with people literally killing one another over who gets those resources. So the wars in Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran can literally be traced to who gets the wealth. You know, so the oil wealth, the food resources, who gets what, basically is a major reason for why all of these different wars take place, including in Africa. And so, of course, our wonderful science and healthcare and all these things are actually the cause for all of this. So our liberal attitudes towards helping people in foreign countries is the reason that those foreign countries are economically collapsing now. How do you like that? Is that an interesting argument? Do you already feel like that's the case? Did you already figure that out yourself? So I have lots of friends that are very liberal, and they all want to help everybody they can find. Actually, they mostly want me to help them. Right? You notice that? They want you to vote to have your money go so you're the one that should donate more money to these people. How can you let these people starve like that? That's how that kind of peer pressure usually works, right? But if you think about it, wait a minute. The reason this population is suffering the way it is because since World War II, we've been feeding populations more food than they ever had available to them. And guess what? Now that the population's increased, instead of the problem being solved, the problem is worse. So that progressive ethic that makes us feel like, gosh, we ought to help all the people of the world, just because, we don't have people starving here because we have Beans Cafe and we have various programs of welfare and food stamps and things of that sort. So there's a way for people to basically feed themselves. By the way, there's more natives in Alaska than there ever have been before, because of all the programs, etc. And by the way, it's also true that the more uneducated the woman, the more children she will have. So the more of an education a woman has, the fewer children she has. So I guess the average for like a college graduate is 1.5 children, which is why you see all those little half children walking around, one leg. That's a joke. Only Lorenzo got the joke. So, I'm just not hilarious. It's also sad, isn't it? Because you feel like, gosh, we ought to help all these people. And yet at the same time, the end result of helping all these people is that the world is in worse shape now than ever. Because there's almost 8 billion people. 8 billion people. I understand that you can't walk around the streets of Calcutta without walking on people. Does that make sense? But I've seen pictures of my friends who've gone to visit Calcutta, and there's places like where there's a park and there's nobody there. So I don't understand how that works. Have you ever been to Calcutta? So utility is consequentialist. It's an attempt to deal with the relativity of ethics and progress, but at the same time, we also realize that science has a lot of consequences that we don't expect, and not all of them are good. In fact, one of the things that's kind of interesting is lately we've discovered that evolution is smarter than we are. That's specific one that I want to grab.
Who by a strange, whether they are the receiver dramatized, just how anachronistic and anthropocentric it is to take human cultural evolution and project it back over the whole great tree of life. Something which happened to one little species so far. Over here, profound change in the biosphere.
We're right here.
Leaving everything else
Here's mammals, and we're right here.
without the particular features
This
we're
is
talking about. And this
prokaryotes,
is most
eukaryotes.
obvious what the late Paul McCready called, I call it the McCready explosion. Some of you have heard.
You said you're
It's bottom up, no comprehension, and the search is not directed. It's basically random trial
Okay,
and
so
error.
like the McCready explosion and so on, he's talking about various stages in world evolution, and one of the main stages was the evolution of intelligent design, small I, small d, by the way. Not that argument that God's intelligent design is right, but he uses intelligent design as in we began genetically modifying our foods, etc. Right? So now we can design things, improve things much faster than evolution did, because evolution is a very slow process. But the problem, of course, is that as we do this, what we end up doing is creating things that turn out to be bad for us as well. Whereas evolution, when it designs something, even though it's much slower, turns out to be actually much more intelligent. And so the newest thing now is so we're in post-intelligent design period, and that is where we're creating computer algorithms that basically end up using evolutionary theory on their own to figure out solutions to problems that are not directed by human intelligence. So basically we're going back to an evolution designing solutions for things, which he thinks will be the next step. So that's pretty interesting. So we talked about the logic. The Mills methods are the advance that basically redesign the way we do science. We talked about utilitarianism as an ethic. There is, I suppose most of the things I talked about sounded pretty bad. I suppose that's because there are a lot of bad implications that come from utility. By the way, another name for utility or utilitarianism is pragmatism. So if you connect the dots here, a lot of John Stuart Mill's impact on philosophy is going to be clearly observable in American philosophy as we start looking at that. So British utilitarianism has a great deal of impact on our American way of thinking. But remember, we're pretty confused because we also have Kantian deontology in our culture. We also have Aristotelian eudaimonistic virtue ethics as part of our system, and we're also concerned about the community. So our ethics are really very confused because of all of these different cultural insights that merge together, even though there's conflicts, like between Kantian philosophy, where you're not allowed to treat a person as a means to an end, but in utility, of course, that's precisely what you can do. So there's a conflict there, and we have to. We're confused because we don't know which solution ought to be the case, because they're in direct conflict. They both sound important to us, and yet at the same time, they are unresolvable that way. And women's equality, I should stress that a little bit. I didn't mention that he was the first politician that introduced a law in England that would give women full equality. It didn't pass, but it was the beginnings of that movement politically. So let me talk a little bit about Bertrand Russell then, too. John Stuart Mill was Bertrand Russell's godfather, which, yes, I know, considering he was an atheist, what does that mean, really? And we have videos of Bertrand Russell. They are old, slow, and...
In 1959, John Freeman's guest on Face to Face was the outstanding mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, then within 2 months of his 87th birthday. But far from being a frail old gentleman, he appeared before the camera as spry, mischievous and articulate as the public had ever known him throughout a long career as a campaigner in various
courses British for he's an asshole.
But it was from the establishment he came. Grandson of 2 lords, one of them Lord John Russell, the Liberal Prime Minister. He went to Cambridge in 1890, where he wrote the Principles of Mathematics, and later his great work, Principia Mathematica. His academic work as one of the greatest philosophers of his day continued at Cambridge until the First World War, when his vigorous campaigning as a pacifist got him expelled from Trinity. But he continued as a writer. His History of Western Philosophy, published in 1945, gaining him a more popular acceptance and lasting financial security. Russell, a late Victorian, was an early crusader for free love, in revolt against the humbug and hypocrisy of much of Edwardian life, a freedom exemplified unashamedly in his own private life. After teaching in America, he returned to Britain in triumph after World War II, was given the Order of Merit in 1949, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950. From the 50s onwards, his main concern was the threat of nuclear annihilation. He was the first president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament at the time of the face-to-face interview. And 2 years later, still battling against authority, he was arrested at an anti-nuclear sit-in in Parliament Square and sentenced to 7 days in jail. He was 89 years old. His face-to-face interview reveals the qualities that sustained his reputation for decades: lucidity of mind, transparent honesty, and an endearing sense of fun.
Mine did of the third Earl Russell, or Bertrand Russell, as he preferred to call himself, at the age of 90, a link with a very distant past is severed. His grandfather, Lord John Russell, was Tory's Prime Minister.
He's reading about
He lived
himself.
in Napoleon in Elba. His maternal grandmother was a friend of the young pretender's widow. In his youth, he did work of importance in mathematical logic, but his eccentric attitude was
You start to look like that when you get 90, I think. I don't know. I hope to find out. When I make 90, I'll share my picture with you on Facebook.
You look like that. Please don't.
I should have the beard still, though.
Whatever it's in that needs to stop.
In the Second World War, he took no public part, having escaped to a neutral country just before its outbreak. In private chair, he died when I was 6. My grandmother survived for a long time after I was married, but she lived in semi-retirement. We saw a lot of distinguished people, especially literary people.
Your grandfather had been a politician in his day, as your father.
My grandfather, yes, my grandfather was Vice Prime Minister. My father was in Parliament for a very brief period.
Did you meet the great and famous who used to come to visit, or were you shut away in the nursery?
Oh, I used to meet them, yes.
Who especially impressed you at that age?
Well, I think Mr. Gladstone especially impressed me.
Well, what's your memory of him?
Oh, I have a great many memories of Mr. Gladstone. He had an eye that could quell anybody. It was, people who didn't know him can't quite understand his political importance. It depended on his hawk's eye. My most painful recollection of him is when I was 17 and very, very shy, and he came to stay with my people, and I was the only male in the family. And after the ladies had retired after dinner, I was left tete-a-tete with Mr. Gladstone. And
Tete-a-tete, head-to-head, face-to-face.
I didn't do anything to alleviate my shyness. He made only one remark. He said, "This is very good pork they've given me, but why have they given it me in a claret glass?" And I didn't know the answer.
Turning to your occupations as a child,
The pork
what were
in
the
the
first
wrong
books
glass.
that impressed you? For instance, were you interested in history, in fairy stories, in adventure, or what?
Oh, I was always very much interested in history, very much. Fairy stories when I was younger, yes. And I regret to say that I liked Hans Andersen much better than Grimm. I don't now, but I did.
So, it's pretty neat. You could actually see videos of him still alive and all. That's pretty darn neat, thanks to the internet. By the way, you also won a Nobel Prize, and so if you look up Russell receiving the prize,
If politics is to become scientific, and if all human activity is prompted by desire, there is a wholly fallacious theory advanced by some earnest moralists to the effect that it is possible to resist desire in the interest of duty and moral principle. I say this is fallacious, not because no man ever acts from a sense of duty, but because duty has no hold on him unless he desires to be dutiful. If you wish to know what men will do, you must know not only or principally their material circumstances, but rather the whole system of their desires with their relative strengths.
so he was pretty important. I remember asking one of my colleagues, Professor Tom Buller here. He's no longer with us. He's moved to the University of Indiana. But he was British. And I asked him if Bertrand Russell was considered to be the greatest British philosopher ever. And he hesitated and said, no, he didn't think so. So it could very well be Mill as the one that a lot of people think was one of the greatest philosophers. They clearly say that Mill was the greatest philosopher of the 19th century. His book on liberty, by the way, was published in 1859, which is exactly the same year that Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. So that's kind of interesting. Also, that's a year before our Civil War began, right? So 1860, 1865. So Lincoln was a contemporary, right? So you just place it into that whole time period. So obviously we're still fighting over slavery. By the way, he was also totally against slaves, although that's kind of interesting. In Mill's work, he argues that slavery might be a good condition, an improvement over primitive life on their way to civilization. So taking people from a primitive society, making them slaves, and then watching their future generations become members of that society might actually be a way of improving their overall lives. And that's actually kind of interesting. There's an American economist, Williams, can't think of his first name. And it's Mason-Dixon University. Walter Williams.
I actually did it, because I was toward the end too.
So Walter Williams, if you've ever read any of his stuff, one of the things that's interesting is he argues, thank God that my ancestors were brought to the United States as slaves, because if it hadn't been for that, instead of the kind of life that he's led, he'd have been leading the kind of life that their relatives in Africa would have led, which is not anywhere near the kind of life he's had. So he's one of those that basically argues that slavery had good results, at least in his case. So that's kind of, where do you want to go with that? And of course, he's very conservative also. So good quiz question today. Okay, here we go. John Stuart Mill has a quote. He says, "It's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." And then he has a follow-up line to it that says, "It's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than blank satisfied." Fill in the blank. Better to be a dissatisfied human than a happy pig. Another way, you might even, I've actually had some students respond that, if they had the choice being a dissatisfied human or a happy pig, they would rather be a happy pig. I thought, no, there's no way. Much better to be an unhappy human than a happy pig, right? Especially when you're the happy pig with a sign on your pen that says, $5.99 a pound, right? So fill in the blank. Better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a happy blank.
Plato. Look at that.
Happy Plato's.
I read it. Dissatisfied. Probably Socrates is dissatisfied. Plato.
it suggests that it's harder for you the smarter you are to be happy.
See, you know how you said, like, you know, the more educated the woman, the less kids they want? I'm like, I can account for that. I want 0.
0 kids?
I want a dog.
You know, those are really hard to raise, 0 kids. Because you never know what to say to them.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I want a dog.
A dog, yes.
I just have a dog. This is